Please welcome Tarun Patel.
We're owned by OMERS, which is a global pension fund. So corporate IT and related security is handled by our partners at OMERS. Where our team steps in is around the management of our actual real estate assets. So you think of the elevator systems in the building, lighting, parking, HVAC. And so operations technology traditionally hasn't been a focus in the security area. And so our mandate from leadership was to unintrusively come in, build a platform and stack that would be modular. So a residential building won't need the same security as, say, their mall or office building, and move us towards zero trust. And in the case of commercial real estate, you're heavily reliant on partners, more so than most industries, because again, we won't fix the HVAC ourselves. Like, we have people who come into our buildings and act as extensions of the company in a way that's different than traditional IT. So it's really important for us to not only allow them to do their job, but at the same time, because they have access to our kind of critical systems, making sure that we have things in place such as PAM, upgraded firewalls, et cetera, put in place to kind of monitor what they're doing, allow them to do what they're doing, but also protect our networks.
Yeah, of course. I think we're going to dive more deeply into an awful lot of that as we go through this. But with those third parties, clearly there's an increased risk. I mean, you very clearly alluded to it there. You talked about some of the things you put in place, but what do you do to manage to mitigate that challenge day to day?
Sure. So one of the first things that we wanted to do is move to a cloud directory service. This allows us to give people a single pane of glass and build kind of profiles depending on which persona you are, whether it's a contractor, internal, and different types of contractors. Second, we're very conscious of what happened to Target, where one of their partners had their password compromised and then they were able to traverse the network. So MFA was a core thing that we wanted to implement right away. So token-based MFA is something that we implemented in tandem with the cloud directory service. And from our perspective, 99% of attacks, password compromise attacks, don't have MFA. So that was a very kind of high ROI. And the last piece was implementing privilege access management. In particular, many of these contractors do require elevated privileges. And so putting in privilege access management allowed us to deprecate the VPN, working with our security partner, so that they're not actually going on our network, but have equivalent like access to that. From a business agility perspective, it also means that we don't have to give them a corporate device to use the VPN, or they don't have to go through their own security process to have that VPN approved by their security. They can do it all through the web, and it's all unintrusive, and allows us to both improve security, but also allow the contractors, particularly in the face of COVID, to be able to do their jobs without actually having to have as much physical access as they would have had before.
Mm. And Dr. Quick mentioned it several times when we were talking to him about his roundtable and that sort of stuff, about this the friction points, the requirement for people not to have to put in two-factor authentication every time they want to just turn up for work and accept a thing on the and blah blah blah, et cetera, et cetera. How does that pan out for you? Because I'm guessing with contractors, there is an element to which they just want to come in, get done what they're getting paid to get done, and probably not go through the rigmarole of everything else.
Yeah, and I think from our perspective, there's always going to be friction as you add more security. The key piece in that is trying to minimize that. So we didn't want to go through SMS or email because we don't know which emails they're going to use. What we did was make it conducive to a BYOD environment. The cloud directory service is something that they can access with their own credentials. PAM works with password injection, and on the MFA side, it's just a push. So you go into the system, you have your first factor authentication with the password, then you get a push on your phone. You can use any Android or iOS phone that's up to date. But ultimately, we also do have to kind of draw a line saying that we're working with these partners, and to some extent, our buildings weren't as secure as we wanted them to be prior to the rollout of MFA. So while we want to make MFA easy to use, we also have to recognize sometimes easy to use means that you're exposing yourself to breaches, and there's a push and pull. And so we are not going to compromise on the MFA side. We'll work, again, to make it easier to do. But ultimately, we'd rather be secure and have a little bit of friction than to have our networks kind of open, especially because some of these building systems can, be dated, 20 years. So once you get in there, you can Google some of the passwords for them. And we can't necessarily change them because of the way the CapEx cycles work in real estate.
So do you have any suggestion on how to budget for a cybersecurity program in terms of building a cost model?
Sure. So from our perspective, one of the things we didn't do is say cybersecurity is a part of the IT budget. Cybersecurity is like any insurance program. You look at what you're insuring and the potential risk, and you want to have something that's modular. Typically in real estate, you charge per square foot. We didn't want to do that. We want to use the right scalars. Typically, that's going to be number of endpoints or devices, data consumption, number of users if you're talking about PAM or MFA. But ultimately, building up a bottom-up model that looks at the different scalars and has a consumption-based model. The analog I'd use is like insurance. In the past, insurance would be kind of very crude in how they price things, but things like telematics allow you to have a consumption-based model. And from our perspective, that was important because residential buildings don't have the same security footprint or IT footprint as, say, a state-of-the-art digital building. And so we wouldn't expect them to spend as much. And so it was important to reflect that in the cost models. And because of the plethora of SaaS tools out there, it makes it relatively easy to move to this model. But the other piece that I would add is it's important to not just look at green dollars, but also your brown dollar spend. That means taking into account overhead and particularly people. So there can be a bias towards going towards tools, but you should also look at it from a TCO perspective. If I put in tool X and it saves money on a green dollar perspective, what is my total cost of operations? Does this cause more friction for my users? Does this inhibit business agility? So I think the key thing is to model security on a consumption basis, look at it holistically from a green dollar and brown dollar perspective, and don't, kind of be in a position where you're just going to do it the way you used to do it with IT. So security is very different. It's changing, and you want that to be reflected in the way you budget and model.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so let's go for the next question here, and then we're going to spin off slightly. So Gartner have chosen privileged access management as the #1 security project for 2 years in a row. Does that align with the current priorities in your organisation?
Definitely. One of the first things that we want to do as part of the IAM stack is implement PAM. First, as I mentioned, we want to get off our VPNs. VPNs don't give us very rich logs. They give us very little control. And from a business perspective, it creates an impediment because, again, you need a corporate device or you need your partner to be able to use your infrastructure. Second, it moves us away from static passwords. People don't share passwords. They now use a vault. That means that we don't have to worry about people forgetting to change a password because the vault will have, if you have admin access for X, you'll have time security, just-in-time security. So, after 8 hours, it has to be refreshed. So you can put checks and balances to help humans. And then the final piece is, in real estate, you don't have 3 to 5 year CapEx refresh cycles like in IT. It can be 5, 10 years plus. And so we have to recognize that we can't just rip out our camera system and upgrade it because the software is out of date. So a key part of our PAM stack is looking at some of these legacy Windows and Linux devices that we have and endpoints, and implementing endpoint privilege management to virtually containerize them. So we can take a Windows desktop and still use password injection and effectively make it like the assets are segregated, even if they're not. And so that's a key part of our next steps in terms of implementing PAM.
Fantastic stuff. So thank you very much. So we've talked about kind of the external pressures on your IT system, and the fact that you need to have lots of third-party access. We talked about the costs, and the cost decisions need to be made there. You were saying residential security probably doesn't have quite as big a budget as the big commercial things. And we talked about privileged access management and how that's a priority. But again, so security is always a series of compromises. It's always a series of risk-based decisions. Isn't it? What's our risk appetite? What's our cost? Et cetera, et cetera. How does your role play into those? What do you think your role is as a security leader in explaining those risk-based decisions, and how does that look?
So, in my case, as a product manager, I sit in between our kind of end customers, which are our sites, who represent our tenants, and our security team. And so one of the key things is to recognize security, looking at security holistically. One example would be in the case of our building cameras. There's an app that allows you to look at them on your phone, kind of like Netflix. But that doesn't work with the PAM. And so we had to make a trade-off between physical security and cybersecurity. And so what we did is we came up with a new architecture that segregated that piece. It cost a little bit more on the cybersecurity side, but ultimately, if we were to force a dogmatic use PAM through the browser, you wouldn't be able to see what's on the cameras. And so ultimately, our job is to keep our customers and end users safe. And in this case, that meant looking at it holistically. So I think from a risk-based perspective, you have to always look at what's the weakest link of the chain, to be cliche. And in this case, it may not always be cybersecurity. It's looking at cybersecurity, and malicious parties are looking at gaps they can exploit, and you want to look at that throughout the value chain and have cybersecurity as kind of a lever to protect. But at the same time, you have to recognize that the business still needs to run. And if we said everything has to go on the PAM, especially in an environment like real estate where you can't necessarily just upgrade everything right away, while we can have security, but that's at the cost of being able to run our actual business.
And let's say it's sort of creating, because the other thing security needs to be, of course, is a learning environment. On the call with producer Jack, when you were discussing this interview, you said a successful security function must be willing to tear up the rule book and start again. What did you mean by that?
So I think that in many cases, security is something that evolves over time. And like anything else, you have to decide when you modify an existing structure versus when you sunset it and move on. One example can be if you're looking at SSO, you can have legacy apps that can't use special characters or long or complex passwords, and you can look to build band-aids around that, or you can recognize that, what's the total investment in maintaining this system? And unless it's a core critical system, maybe the best solution is to either deprecate that entirely or look at sunsetting it, in the short to medium term. So I think the key part in that discussion is that cybersecurity is there to support and enable the business, and you have to fight the bias to trying to lock everything down, because ultimately, if you use COVID as an example, I think a lot of us are kind of getting stir crazy sitting in the house, and so you have to kind of find the right balance between doing what, let's say, is in NIST, but NIST is not there to keep you in business. It's there to give you a guidebook, and you have to understand what's important for you. So like in our case, DLP is not important because we don't have PII information on our OT networks, but MFA, PAM, those things are incredibly important because of our reliance on third parties and outside contractors.
Yeah, of course. And it always reminds me, when you look at these things, of the Bill Gates quote, which I'm going to misquote, but that's sort of effectively, nothing seems to happen in a year, an awful lot seems to happen in 10 years. And I just want to go back to that, you talked about ripping up the rule book, but what you described there seems to be more of an evolution. And I'm wondering if there are examples you can think of where actually something has come along which has necessitated ripping up the rule book rather than a more gentle evolution, which of course, when you look at it with a wider view, can look like a revolution.
So, in our case, we had the benefit of not really having any security there. So effectively, there was no rule book. I think if you go back to an environment, again, like one example would be, I've seen in many cases, they'll take staff that are in a service desk who oftentimes are doing kind of routinized tasks that are structured, and then move them to kind of a security role where there's more of a strategic requirement. I think you have to say, do I have the right people to do this? If I do I need to train them, or do I actually go and work with a partner? Use a SOC, use managed service providers, use SaaS tools. I think you really have to recognize that with security being fast moving, you may not have the people and processes in place, and ultimately you may have to do larger changes in terms of hiring different types of skills. Like in our case, we went to a product model because having a one-size-fits-all security program for all our buildings wouldn't work and provide an optimal tenant experience. We could, for example, impose the same cost for residential building as a commercial building, but then you as a tenant would pay more, and you wouldn't necessarily get the value around that. So I think it's important to just recognize what you can do with what you have and where you need to partner. And in many cases, you're going to have to partner because security is, for example, it really makes very little sense to run, your mail on premise. We saw the Exchange hack earlier in the year, and I think this is where, unless you have a reason to, like a regulatory reason or outside pull to manage email, it's better to have Microsoft or Google or somebody else who does this all day manage that, even if that causes friction within your organization.
I'm curious about how, the nitty gritty of it. Cybersecurity, Tony talked about it there, it's getting far more up the executive agenda. It's becoming a far bigger topic. You've got regulators paying attention to it now. You've got governments paying attention to it. All these sorts of things. You talked about insurance being predicated on passing, pen tests and all these sorts of things. And yet, there is still that human thing of having to go in and fight for budget to get to what you want to get to. How do you manage just the friction, the day-to-day friction of, here is what we need to do, this is what we need to secure, this is how much it's going to cost, and people going, no, I don't think so, Tarun.
So I think in our case, I've been fortunate. Our leadership has been very proactive in emphasizing the need to modernize cybersecurity in particular, because there's an emphasis on digital buildings and digitizing them. I think what we found most successful is to listen to people rather than just having a cybersecurity program that we impose top down. We work with our different site operators to understand, how does your business run? What are the critical pieces? Do your tenants ask, if you have, do tenants put clauses in leases? And ultimately, from our perspective, it was about transparency. We have a very detailed cost model that takes about 50 plus SKUs and allows them to say, you're paying this much exactly for this thing. Another piece that we've accompanied with that is we have like a product catalog that doesn't just say, EDR. It explains what EDR is and why there's business value for it. And then other pieces to demo things. I mean, I have a great operations technology team and partner and infrastructure partner who has a great relationship with the site. So, they've gone and shown how PAM allows them to give access to the lighting system to the vendor that deals with that, but then they can't touch the signs. And that's where, from a building perspective, they start to see some of the value. It's, we don't have to monitor as many of these things. But I think there's always going to be the friction when you're paying for anything that can be seen as a cost center. I think it's just important to be transparent. It's important to understand how you enable the business. Again, on the PAM example, it doesn't just cost money for the PAM, but it saves money because we don't have to give somebody a corporate laptop. We don't have to track that. It also means that from the vendor's perspective, they can come in and out faster because they don't have to install software. So I think it's also making sure you understand the tools that can convey the business value. Something like MFA. I think when you show that 99% of password compromises didn't have MFA, but what we found is you get executives to want MFA for their own personal use, when they go to the bank. And I think, look, change, there's always going to be people resistant to change. I think you just lay out the case the best as you can. You try to be transparent and you recognize that it's a journey. You're going to hit obstacles, but you just keep going. And I mean, to some extent, the fact that there's a new hack every day doesn't hurt.
No, it's fantastic stuff. Thank you, Richie. So talk the language of the business, be transparent on what you're doing, educate everyone. I like the fact you're talking about, you educate in various different media, very different channels and ways. And then one final thing, you talked about smart buildings, digital city, et cetera, all those sorts of things coming up. Are we at the stage then now, do you think, where in your sector, security is a competitive advantage? It's clearly table stakes. Is it becoming an advantage?
I think it's too early to say. I think there's more emphasis on security, but real estate's multi-trillion-dollar industry. There's lots of regional regulations that apply to real estate, so I think it's becoming more important. But again, you're looking at CapEx cycles that can last into decades. That's not going to change overnight. As we move more towards digital and automated buildings, security will become more important, but we're still very early on that journey. There aren't many, very digital stores. I mean, I think, we think of Amazon Go, that's an outlier. I mean, most of the time the digital building is just a lighting system that might that's kind of like a Google Home, or Nest. It's still very much in its infant stages, and from a building perspective, there's a broader interoperability on the ecosystem that needs to be developed. There is no kind of Android or iOS ecosystem in the building place. That's still being established, but that will become more important. I think we can use that time to kind of buttress and improve security in our OT space as it is. And then again, as we go through things like M&A or new developments, that's where we start to incorporate cyber from the beginning. So we can have kind of an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure kind of thing.
Thank you very much indeed. Tarun Patel, really, really appreciate you getting us going today. Thank you very much indeed, sir. Speak to you later. Have a great day, great rest of the summit. Thank you, Tarun.
Cheers.